as we move towards the conclusion of this course, I want to really start focusing on not just the larger forces that have impacted our history, but also the way that just normal people have also interacted with history. And I'm going to be giving a number of examples, but we're going to be mainly looking at, it's actually a chapter that I wrote coming out of a 2016 conference that took place at Nipissing University. It was a panel on the Holocaust, and I was looking at it through the lens of ritual, ceremony, and pilgrimage, areas that I'm very interested in. And it was kind of set up as a debate between me and another scholar who felt that people traveling to Auschwitz, it was kind of like people going to Disneyland, and it made a mockery of it, and it was kitschy and so on. And so we had a back and forth, respectful back and forth. But this is my argument that I'm going to be making here. We're going to be working with my chapter, and I'll be sending it to you just as a file, because it was just too hard to get copyright on my own writing. Very strange, but whatever. So I'll be sending the article to you, and I'm going to go through a bit of the more complex aspects of it, and then we're going to conclude by looking at some of the issues around memorialization in the Canadian case. So the first argument I'm making in the chapter is that the Holocaust exists in Western culture as a point of rupture. I believe it's a watershed event, and we know that it led to things like the creation of the United Nations, but it had even more serious repercussions. It impacted Jewish-Christian relations, it impacted ideas about race, and so we actually start to see after the Holocaust significant numbers of people deconstructing or attempting to deconstruct those codes of domination that we've been discussing in this course, and that's only picked up steam in the 21st century. So the image here is of the train tracks into Auschwitz, and I argue in the chapter that this site becomes a node in a kind of map of meaning, and it becomes a signifier of the whole Holocaust. Even though the majority of Jews were actually killed elsewhere, this particular space becomes the sort of site for people to visit. And this came about very at a very grassroots level, with just individuals and families going to the site. The Poles were not particularly happy about this at first. On some level, in a lot of places in Europe, they just wanted to forget the history. But we started to see a steady stream of people going back. Some were survivors, some weren't. And gradually over time, it becomes what I would argue is a secular and religious site of pilgrimage. And so, for instance, a friend of mine who's Danish told me that in Danish high schools, they make trips to Auschwitz as part of how they learn about history and World War II. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the people that go are from the nations most impacted by the Holocaust and World War II. So countries like Britain, Israel, Germany, Canada, the United States, where there are large Jewish populations. So at the conference, part of the back and forth was whether this was a serious mode of engaging with history. And so I probably would have had more sympathy for the other argument, but having gone to Amsterdam and visiting the Anne Frank Museum, I completely have come over onto the side of the need for a physical space to be in that space, and the Dutch have done a wonderful job where they've just kept it as it was. To see the drawings that Anne Frank made and so on had a very, very profound effect in a way that just reading about it doesn't. And so that also convinced me even further that these spaces of memorialization are very important. In the next section, I talk about the idea of tourist versus pilgrim. And this is a topic that gets discussed in the field of pilgrimage studies quite a bit. And it was interesting on the panel, Dr. Hilary Earle was also there, and she has taken a number of different history classes to Auschwitz. So alongside academic study, where you look at photographs like this one and read sources, she also took them to the actual sites to give a kind of three-dimensional experience. So this idea of many different intentions when one goes to the site, I think, is important. And so I've talked about it here using the example of Holocaust survivor Renee Chernoff, who was very determined in the beginning that she wasn't going to be a pilgrim, but found herself reacting as, quote, a mourning sister, a survivor mother, acting as an expert guide, and an American Jew concerned about the contemporary politics of memory. And often in articles on these trips to Auschwitz, even in very secular publications, we find that word pilgrim coming up again and again, because there's clearly an intuitive sense that when one takes a trip to a site like this, there's something more going on than just simply looking at something like a pleasure trip. There's something much deeper going on when we do that. Here we have a photograph of 3 survivors returning to the site of Auschwitz. I love the way they're supporting each other here. I can't even begin to imagine what that would be like to go back. And it's very common for survivors to take family members, and I think this is also very important because I personally know a case of a family in Toronto where the grandparent or parent could not speak of it at all, and so it caused a kind of intergenerational trauma, this idea that there's this incredibly traumatic event that can't be spoken about. So in a sense, going back to the site, you don't need to speak, you can just live within the site. And so I think it is can be highly therapeutic. I'm not saying that's always the case. I think it depends on the individual family and the survivor. But this has become very common now, particularly on anniversaries, for survivors to return to the site. Pretty much the rest of the chapter is looking at the impact of pilgrimages to Auschwitz on Christian-Jewish relationships, and increasingly also Muslim groups are now going to Auschwitz. So the site also becomes a way to work with highly problematic historical relationships. And so I won't go into all the details, you can read through, but many of you will know that Christianity and Judaism have a very difficult history together, and Christianity, as is widely known, developed a kind of, I don't call it anti-Semitism, that's a more modern phenomenon, but anti-Jewish theology. And so we've talked about this in terms of the expulsions from Spain and Portugal of the Jews. So Auschwitz, in a sense, has become a site to try to mediate that very difficult history. And so I use the idea of witnessing, which is both a Jewish and a Christian concept, that idea of bearing witness to an event so that it won't be forgotten, and also the idea of atonement. So that idea within Christianity of atoning for one's sins, and within Judaism. So in a way, this shared theological language can be used, and I would say it's often used, people don't even necessarily think of it consciously, but so a Catholic will go and light a candle. So they're using very traditional Christian gestures to show respect and to witness and to atone. So again, we've seen record numbers of people going to Auschwitz every year, and so many Christian groups go. They may go en masse to do certain rituals and to pray and light candles and so on. Now, there has been controversy about this when there was the idea was put forward of building a convent or a monastery nearby, and that was completely shut down by the Jewish community. So I'm not saying this has been an easy or simple process, but what I find fascinating about it is it's just normal people trying to work through these incredibly dark parts of our history. And as I say in the chapter, they kind of walk into this void and light a candle. And so I think it's very moving that it's done in this kind of just instinctive way to try to put forward a gesture towards justice and reconciliation. So alongside travel to sites like Auschwitz, we also see the creation of Holocaust Memorial Day, which is marked in Canada every year and in countries around the world. And again, you note the candles being used. I know in the one in Toronto, they typically have a week of Holocaust education, and then they have a ceremony where they read through every name of every Jewish person that died in the Holocaust, and people take turns reading through all the names. So it's developed this very powerful series of rituals that take place. And increasingly, it also memorializes the genocides that have taken place since World War II, including in Cambodia and in Rwanda. In recent years, this process of memorialization has become more and more important, and so with the revelation of the unmarked graves attached to residential schools, there was a spontaneous outpouring of emotion, and also, as many of you will know and will have seen, the putting of shoes to represent the lives of the children that were lost outside of various Catholic churches. And so I know that I saw the one in North Bay. There were shoes put on the steps of the Pro Cathedral, and it was very, very powerful way of drawing attention and making sure that this didn't just disappear from the news cycle. And so again, I find it absolutely remarkable that people just instinctively marked these discoveries in a way that was so meaningful, both to the people who went through it and to the larger Canadian society. Now, we can talk about this more as we move towards the end of the course, but this, as I think all of you know, is the first year in which there was a national holiday recognizing a Day for Truth and Reconciliation that falls from now on September 30th. And of course, there are mixed feelings about this. There's certainly a lot of argument about even using the word reconciliation. But it was one of the calls made in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. So I do think it's important. I don't think it's obviously the only answer, but it's certainly important. And I think it was also vital that Ottawa take the lead on this because various First Nations have been holding ceremonies, but it was very important to make this a nationwide day of reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, or at least education. And so I watched the CBC, the live footage, and I thought it was actually quite amazing. The speakers were just phenomenal, and there was a spirit march afterwards as well. As part of marking the day, again, as many of you will know, many specific sites around the country were lit orange to, again, so this kind of symbolism of the orange shirt that goes back to recognizing the history of the residential schools and the larger campaign called Every Child Matters. And so orange has become the symbolic color of truth and reconciliation. And I believe the CN Tower was lit up orange as well. So various sites around the country. And as will probably not surprise you, I think this kind of symbolism is actually very important. And I think it speaks to us on a very deep kind of level that perhaps just talking about things doesn't. And so I do think that kind of symbolism is a very important part of the process. And I just want to conclude this presentation by talking a little bit about the event that was held at Nipissing University. There were no pictures taken at the actual event. So as you can see here, the university library was lit orange in recognition of the day. And there was also a vigil held in the courtyard of the student center that I attended, using smudge, using candles. And there was a talk given by a residential school survivor. So I'm not going to lie, it was difficult. It was difficult. I can only imagine. And for that survivor, who she's told the story a number of times, again, I can't even imagine what that would be like. But regardless, it was very, very important that this also be recognized by Nipissing University, which of course sits on the territory of Nipissing First Nation. And so we can see that while it's important that Ottawa is sponsoring events, it's also important that institutions like universities are also participating in marking these days of truth and reconciliation.